What you'll hear next wouldn't be possible without the support of readers, viewers, and listeners like you. In organizations such as the Berlin Science Week, New York City Economic Development Corporation, Rita Allen Foundation, and the Civic Science Media Lab. Visit civicsciencemedia.org to learn more.
Welcome to Consider This Next on Civic Sci TV Radio. I'm your host, Kacie Luaders. Here on the show, we connect with diverse voices across the civic science landscape. Scholars, practitioners, and leaders shaping the intersections of science within our society. Our mission? To uncover lessons from their work and translate them into actionable insights. Like all programs from the Civic Science Media Lab, whether on video, radio, or digital print, Consider This Next is here to keep decision makers, from researchers and practitioners to local community members, informed, inspired, and equipped with the latest insights. Science communication often gets labeled as either technical and academic or oversimplified and watered down. But what if the key to sharing complex ideas isn't about dumbing things down, but rather meeting your audience where they are? Today on Consider This Next, we're talking to Zakiya Whatley, a molecular biologist turned full-time science communicator, who's proving that effective communication starts with understanding who you're talking to. From hosting podcasts that blend pop culture with cutting-edge research to producing planetarium films, she's showing us that great science communication is as much about the delivery as it is about the data. So we are joined today by a science communicator who has been making waves in all sorts of areas, and we're going to touch on a few of them today. But first, I would just love it if you could introduce yourself and tell the folks listening what you do.
My name is Zakiya Whatley. I am trained as a molecular biologist. I have a background in cell and molecular biology and genetics and genomics, and I am a full-time science communicator.
All right, so a full-time science communicator. Let's break down what that means within the scope of all the things that you do. Can you talk to us about a few of the projects that you are currently working on?
So I think a lot of my work is in the audio space. Right now, I am a founding host and executive producer of Dope Labs podcast, which is where science meets pop culture. That's a show for, I'll put in quotes, the general public, to understand what's happening in the zeitgeist and the science behind it. So we say, what are you already talking about? What's already on your timeline? And what's the science behind that? In addition to Dope Labs, I also host Breakthrough, which is a podcast from Boston Children's Hospital. And then sometimes you can find me on Science Magazine's podcast talking about some of the latest cutting edge biology research.
So that is a really interesting niche. Not only are you a science communicator primarily in the audio spaces where you're finding yourself.
Mhm.
And so I would be curious to know for each of the shows that you host or produce or work on, what is your approach to delivering the information to the various audiences? I'm assuming you have to consider the audience that you're speaking to for each of these programs.
Absolutely. Audience is my true north, like my guiding star when I am thinking about how I'm developing a show or even how I'm showing up for it. So if it's not a show that I'm producing, but a show that I'm hosting, I think about audience first. I think a lot of the cutting edge or most widely accepted science communication research tells us that it's not just a knowledge gap that we're looking at. I think a lot of times people talk about the deficit model of what people know and what they don't know and trying to be the bridge between those two things. That alone is not the indicator of whether or not somebody receives information. A lot of it is behavior and a lot of it's driven by psychology. And so I try to say, what is my audience? Who is my audience? What are they into? What are they already talking about? And that informs how I speak, what jokes I might tell, what I might reference. I think sometimes when I consider audience, one of my favorite things to tell people is if I'm in the South, I'm saying toboggan. If I am in the North, I'm saying beanie. Okay, and that's for a hat. And I just think there are small things that tell people that signal like this person is a part of my group or this person maybe understands my experience and they are speaking to me. And so a lot of that looks different. I think when I first started Dope Labs, I was just moving out of a tenure track position and into managing a PhD program where I'm using a lot of academic lingo and I'm talking about molecular biology all the time. And I want to turn that teacher voice or that professor voice off. And on Dope Labs, I want it to feel casual. I want people to feel like they're sitting on the couch with me talking to my friend because that's actually what we were doing when we were recording. And so that feels very different compared to when I'm on Boston Children's Breakthrough podcast, where I'm talking to families who have been affected by tragedy, and knowing that my listeners or my audience may be people who are considering procedures for their loved ones, right? And so there's a certain amount of care, there's a certain amount of compassion and just some carefulness around what might be going through the audience's mind as they're hearing some of these things and what kind of questions can I ask on their behalf of the experts on the show. So it's very different depending on who my audience is, how I engage the experts that I'm interviewing or the material that I'm covering.
So that's very interesting. It's almost as if the information is the way that it's delivered is almost as important as the information itself.
Yes, I would. For me, delivery first, information second. I think that's some of what we know about the impact of even when we look at the rollout of different drugs and things like that, delivery is so key for acceptance and understanding. Hey, you also want to deliver things in a way where people feel that they're free to accept the information or not, what we call like ethical persuasion. And so it's not, hey, you're going to be banished if or you're going to be looked down on if you don't believe this thing. It's like, hey, take it or leave it. I'm just sharing my experience and what I've found.
Do you have any advice for science communicators who they may feel comfortable with their level of expertise? They feel comfortable presenting the paper at the conference with other science professionals,
Hmm.
but maybe feel perhaps even slightly intimidated by, okay, I don't know how to communicate this to someone who isn't on my same level of expertise. How do I even start to try to figure out what humor to throw in or what references? Like that almost in and of itself seems like a process to being able to best connect with different types of audiences. Do you have any advice for where they could begin?
I have a lot of advice. And usually putting those things into workshops and working with people or groups of folks. I work with different institutions. Sometimes that's a one off. Sometimes I work with cohorts over multiple weeks to get them ready for something like this, right? Sometimes that looks like media training. I think one of the first things that I encourage people to do is to just really drill down the message. What is it that if there's one thing that you want to get across, what is it? And to backwards design. I think so much of I'll say traditional science communication, so that's delivery of papers and giving talks at conferences. A lot of that is designed where you are starting with what do I know? What's unknown? And then you slowly reveal what it is you're trying to tell the audience, what you've discovered. And that's the opposite of the way the majority of the world receives information. When I go to a movie, I already know what the movie is about because there's a trailer. And so it's almost like you have to flip that paradigm on its head to if you want to connect with different audiences or people who are not a part of this group that approach information the exact way that most scientists are trained to deliver it. And so I think you have to really begin with that message and say, what is the point? And put that point up front. So even if people zone out throughout the talk, you're putting it up front and then you're saying, who is my audience? And even though I have 5 to 10 great pieces of data that I want to share, or I have these readings from this new experiment that I did that are so cool. Most people can't hold more than 2 to 3 things in their mind at a time. So, what is the overarching point, and what are the 2 to 3 things that are going to support that? I think simplify, simplify, simplify is always the message, but that's really hard when you are steeped in this work. And so much of the work feels like it's part of who you are. It's like saying, you have 10 children, only bring 3 along. How will you pick the 7 that you leave behind? I think it can feel like that for scientists sometimes.
Well, speaking of this children metaphor,
Hmm.
yes, audio is your primary baby, but
Yeah.
I know that you also work in other forms of science communication. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the other exciting projects that you've worked on, that you
Yeah.
are going to be working on as a full time science communicator?
Yes, I think so. Some of the things that I've done in the past, and I haven't done as much lately, and I'm looking to change that, is writing. So I think I had the science communication bug very early on from a lot of informal science outreach I was doing. But I think maybe it was in my postdoc, I was a co-author on a paper that was like a cover for American Scientists, and I just remember people writing back about this article that we had written, and it was just so fun and so exciting, and I was like, my class is not limited to how many people can register anymore. I'm able to now talk to people through mass media in a way that I hadn't been able to before. And it was like in Barnes and Noble. And so that feels really accessible in a way that private college education didn't. So that was when I first started doing a lot of writing. So I started there. I think I've also done a piece for Scientific American in addition to American Scientist. And there's a lot happening right now. And so I am drafting many op-eds to see where they might land. So I do a little bit of that. In addition to that, I've moved into the film space. So in 2023, I was a Jackson Wild Media Lab fellow. And so that is wildlife, nature documentaries, really exploring the science of the world around us. I'm really interested in how wildlife and nature and human activity intersect. I think those things are a lot closer than sometimes we think. I think people think wildlife is and nature are these things that are far away from us. And I'm like, no, that's what you're doing as soon as you walk out of your door. You are a part of it. And so I really was excited about that. And in addition to building kind of my own skills in that space. I also am executive producing a planetarium film. So in addition to a documentary, I'm working on a planetarium film with the Hayden Planetarium at the Museum of Science in Boston, and that should premiere this fall, fall 2025. So I'm very, very excited about that. It's been a long time coming, and I've had a chance to meet some really great people for this project, and so I'm really excited to share some of their stories along the way.
Those are certainly impressive projects that you have going on. I would love to know at this particular time in our socio-political environment, there are interesting things that are happening both in the formal academic space and interesting things when it comes to how people are getting information, how
Yes.
people are hopefully learning how to discern what is factual information and what isn't factual information. And sometimes it just seems like there's just a big nebulous cloud of just noise that's happening. Why do you think that folks like you who are able to take high level concepts and break them down and make them accessible to different types of audiences is going to be Pro probably extra important during this particular time in our socio-political climate.
I think this type of work is particularly important because we are in an era where information is not limited by any kind of resource, right? So what I mean by that is it used to be really expensive to have a television and to have service to deliver programming that would give you news to your home, right? It could be expensive to get a newspaper. I think all of those things are the way people used to get information. And now with the internet and with so many platforms and even creating your own platform if you're not even on the major social media sites, even with websites and the ability to share information in what I think is still the information age. Even when we think about AI and the ability to just create more and more text, I think what becomes difficult is to decipher that text. I think media and the production of it is moving very quickly. So there's no longer five stations that you look at with trustworthy news anchors that you've known over time. There are people you see who you feel like I like. They told me these jokes, and they also talked about this other thing. So I like the jokes, and I also like the other thing they told me. I think this is a new ecosystem, and the media is moving faster. The systems and the technology are moving faster, but our brains have not caught up, right? And so our brains are still under the pressures of evolution, and it's evolving slowly. We're behind compared to how fast technology is moving. So the human brain is wired for categorization, for ease of processing information. I dump these people into this category, these other people into another category. What we're seeing is facts that usually have no value over what you do day to day or have no weight on what you do day to day are now signals for what type of group you're in. And I think we've seen this over time over and over again, when you look back in history, it's evident that sometimes social death, so being a part of a group and being outcast from that group, is more frightening than actual physical death. Like we've seen that when people refuse to get vaccinated or refuse treatment because somebody has said, if you're part of this group, you don't do this, or if you're part of this group, you take this medicine. And I think we're seeing more of those things that are just hardwired psychosocial drivers that are part of human evolution and what it looks like to be human in this day and age. We're just seeing those same things that were good for survival and anxiety about a lot of stimulus, things that were good for survival for us under different circumstances, be detrimental and make it hard for us to process these new circumstances in this new environment we're in where there's information overload and constant stimulus all the time.
Yes, that is it's interesting to think about while living it, because I think we're
Yes,
all probably guilty in some way of like,
absolutely.
yeah.
I think it's so important. Something you said, you just asked, how people like me are doing this. And I think the thing that I would also add is that people like me are subject to those exact same things. My brain is uh, having a lot of confirmation bias, a lot of cognitive dissonance. And I think knowing about it doesn't make it any easier to avoid those trappings. I think it's just a constant check that I'm doing all the time. Hey, you're saying this thing. Is this actually true? Do you have evidence that supports this? Are you looking for anything on the other side that counters it? And I think everybody's susceptible to it. There are 2 women who wrote this book called Science Denial, Gail Sinatra and Barbara Hofer, and we also had them on Dope Lab. So they did a episode, it's Lab 37, called Science Denial, and they talk about people picking and choosing what they believe. People don't take a blanket non-belief to science, right? They understand gravity, they trust that they don't float off when they walk outside, but people are picking and choosing what worked for them and their argument at the time. I think it's been really interesting. Just lately, we've seen, I just came back from the AAAS meeting, which is the American Academy for the Advancement of Science. And scientists from a lot of different fields were there, and they were talking about what's been happening under the new administration's change and what it's meant for grant funding and for how the scientific enterprise operates. And somebody was like, well, Elon Musk doesn't believe in science. And I'm like, that's crazy. Of course, Elon Musk, he might not like how you're doing it, but you don't have Tesla, you don't have SpaceX and not believe in science. And so I think that's another just prime example of that picking and choosing what works for what you're trying to do or what your mission is at the time.
Well, yes, we are happy that there are folks who even you in sharing your vulnerabilities about being susceptible to the things you're also trying to counter with your work. I think
Yeah.
that type of vulnerability is what people connect with
Mhm.
and what is going to help more people to hopefully find credible sources like you and get the right information. And so we are appreciative of that. And so I would love for you to tell us, how can people stay in touch with you, find out more about what you have going on throughout the year? Where can people find out more about your work?
You can find out more about my work at zakiyawhatley.com. If you are on social media, I am usually on Instagram sharing whatever is going on at Z Said So. Also, you can hear the newest episodes of Dope Labs. Dope Labs begins March 9th, and we will have a new episode every week for the next year. And so you can find Dope Labs anywhere you listen to podcasts, and you can also find us at Dope Labs Podcast on Instagram.
Zakiya's approach to science communication reminds us that reaching audiences isn't just about what you say, it's how and why you say it. As you think about your own work in science communication, consider this next. What assumptions are you making about your audience? How might you flip your approach from what do I want to tell them to what are they already talking about? What signals can you send that tell your audience you understand their experience? When you look at your core message, what 2 or 3 points truly support it? And lastly, how can you make space for your audience to engage with information on their own terms? These questions might help us bridge the gap between expertise and accessibility in ways that serve both the science and the people we're trying to reach. Before we sign off, I'd like to offer a big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in and engaging with these crucial topics. If you found value in this podcast, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Your support helps us continue to bring you insightful conversations like this one. Until next time, keep nurturing your curiosity and stay connected to the science all around you. This is Kacie signing off from Consider This Next on Civic Sci TV Radio.